Today, 2004 presidential candidate, and I really appreciate you taking the time out today to come in. And
No
how
problem.
are you doing?
Anything I can do to light the fires of liberty.
As I said, you were a presidential candidate in 2004, and I believe you have one of the most unique experiences of the presidential candidate, especially for that year. And I know someone else had a similar experience with you. I believe it was, October when you went to a presidential debate?
That was the presidential debate in St. Louis, Missouri. It was the second of three. My friend David Cobb was the presidential nominee for the Green Party. And David and I would challenge each other in debates to get a little bit of publicity. And we would always invite George Bush and John Kerry. Naturally, they would never show up. So David Cobb invited me to do a little bit of civil disobedience at the debate in St. Louis. Naturally, the Democrats and Republicans would not allow third-party candidates to participate in the debate. God forbid that we should actually talk about the Constitution. So we did a long march, and at some point in the evening, David and I were scheduled to cross the police line. And David threw himself through the police line like a football player, crashing through a tackle. I was a little bit more subdued about the whole event. But ultimately, both of us were arrested and handcuffed and put into a police van, at which point David and I sat there in our jackets and ties, handcuffed at the back of a police paddy wagon, and David was apologizing to me, for having gotten me arrested. And I said, David, I knew the job was dangerous when I took it. I mean, that's what civil disobedience is all about. So after sitting in the van for about 20 minutes, the back doors opened, and a police officer said, which one of you guys is a presidential candidate? And I said, well, we are both presidential candidates. We are at a presidential debate, and you have us in handcuffs. I said, can you explain that to me? They looked very perplexed and said, let me get back to you on that. So they closed the door and started the van. They were actually getting ready to take us to the police station, and then they turned the van off. And we sat there for a while longer, and they threw 5 college students into the back of the van. Now, these college students may or may not have been aware that there was even a presidential debate. They were just walking home from class the way they had done every night for a semester or more. And suddenly, from out of the dark, these 5 ninjas, people dressed in black, jumped out and threw them to the ground. These children were terrified. They thought they were going to be murdered. When they discovered that they were only being arrested, they were thrilled to death. I mean, that they were actually going to live. So they put these 5 college students in the back of the van with us, and they looked at these 2 adult men in jackets and ties, and they were totally confused. It's like, what are you guys doing here? Took us 10 minutes or more to convince them that we were presidential candidates. So we were all thrown in jail together. They released all of us at 12:01, just after midnight. Obviously, the intention was to keep David and I anywhere from being on the stage. And the college students were thrilled. They couldn't wait to get our autographs afterwards.
I bet.
So it was about 1:30 in the morning before my campaign manager found me. They gave me back all my belongings. I had my cell phone. And when I called my campaign manager, he says, where are you at? And I says, I literally have no clue. They had shoved us out the door. We were standing under a mercury vapor, street lamp. And there were no street signs. We were kind of in the middle of nowhere. And so they had to call the police, department and said, hypothetically, if I was a presidential candidate and I had gotten arrested at a presidential debate, where would I be right now? So it took them about half an hour to 45 minutes to track down where they had taken us. But my website got over 1 million hits that evening as everybody kept checking in every so often to find out if I had been shot and killed behind the police station.
Jeez.
But clearly there is no freedom of speech in the United States. A fact that I discovered earlier in the campaign, I had been speaking to a group of college students, and I was in this beautiful auditorium with, somewhere between 300 and 350 seats. It was a brand new facility. It was beautiful. And there were only 10 or 12 students in the front row. Well, I thought this was a waste of space, and I recommended that we, relocate to a classroom. That way we could be closer. We'd be able to talk a little bit more informally. And that was when I was informed that I had to be in the auditorium, because as a presidential candidate, I had to be in a free speech zone. I almost fell off the stage. I said, what about the hallway? What about the rest of the campus? And I was informed, jokingly, I think, that was a speech-free zone. At which point I pointed at my boots and I told those students that anywhere I happen to be standing is a free speech zone. Nobody tells me what I can and cannot say. Nobody tells me where I can or cannot say it. So that has become kind of a famous quote of mine.
Yeah, I've heard that one before. Now, I know in 2009, a few years later, you participated in the Continental Congress.
Yes.
And just so folks know what that is, because I think there's a misconception of what a Continental Congress really is. Maybe you could clarify that.
Well, the best way to explain it is to rewind history back to 1774. In the winter of 1774, the people in the 13 colonies were being, harassed by higher taxes, a series of laws that we referred to as the Intolerable Acts. And life in the colonies was becoming more and more difficult. The most disappointing part is that every time we attempted to negotiate with King George, just asking for the taxes to be lowered or, some onerous law to be lifted, King George would flat out ignore us. If you look in the Declaration of Independence, it says that our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. And so it wasn't the taxes or the laws that bothered us as much as the fact that the king refused to speak with us. I mean, it just flat out ignored us. And that was the trigger that caused the people in the colonies to gather delegates together to send them to Philadelphia. And the purpose of this gathering in Philadelphia was to analyze the situation, look over all of our options, and, recommend a plan of attack. Tell us what we can do to fix this problem. Well, in 1776, this group of delegates eventually signed the Declaration of Independence and recommended that we go to war with England as the only possible solution to solve the problem. We are experiencing much the same problems that the colonies did in 1774. The government continues to raise our taxes. We have all sorts of new taxes. We have many, many laws that Congress is passing. The Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the Homegrown Terrorist Act, the National Defense Authorization Act. Every time we think things cannot get worse, they do. And we call our representatives, we go to the polls and vote, and none of our actions are having any mitigating effect. Things continue to get worse regardless what we do. And so people took the same response. They gathered delegates from 50 states. These delegates went to St. Charles, Illinois, for an 11-day period in November of 2009. And the purpose of this delegation was to analyze the situation and make some recommendations. This organization was called Continental Congress 2009. And the result of roughly 2 weeks of deliberation is a document called the Articles of Freedom. The Articles of Freedom are organized into sections: First Amendment, Second Amendment, income taxes, etc. Each section outlines what the Constitution says, gives examples of how the state and federal government are violating the Constitution, and each section is then concluded with a list of remedies that the federal government is obligated to take, a list of remedies that the state government is obligated to take, and a list of recommendations that each individual citizen is encouraged to follow through on. As we discuss the Constitution, as we discuss how much of what our government does is actually unconstitutional, people always come to the same question. What can I do? I'm only one person. How can I personally have any change or effect on what is happening? Well, if your listeners go to articlesoffreedom.us, they can download a copy of the Articles of Freedom, and they can read each of these, the recommendations in each of these sections. Now, most people will download the Articles of Freedom, and their next reaction is, oh my God, this is like 65 pages long. Like, why is this document so big? And I respond that, given all the unconstitutional things that the government is doing, the list of infractions would not fit on a yellow Post-it note. And just by virtue of the fact that the Articles of Freedom is so long is one of the indications of how much our government is doing that is literally not authorized to do.
Well, isn't there like 17 duties that they're supposed to be doing per the Constitution?
Well, the Constitution gives Congress authority, and that authority is listed in Article 1, Section 8. Now, there are 18 clauses in Section 8 which list all of the authorities that Congress has. By definition, if Congress is doing something which is not listed in Article 1, Section 8, it is, by definition, unconstitutional. Article 1, Section 9 is a list of things that Congress and the federal government are not allowed to do. And Article 1, Section 10 is a list of things that the state governments may not do. And so the Constitution is a document of negative authority. It spends most of its time telling the government what it cannot do. And there's actually a very small section, Article 1, Section 8, that tells Congress what it can do. The most important thing at this juncture is for your listeners to understand that we, the people, are the source of all political power in the United States. We, the people, are sovereign, and we are born with rights. We have our rights endowed to us by our Creator, and we grant the government privileges. Now, the difference between a right and a privilege is that a right is something that you can do without asking. A privilege is something which a higher authority allows you to do. So I can walk on my property, I have a right to walk on my property, but I have to get permission to walk on your property. Rights and privileges are opposites, and we have rights, we give government privileges, and we can take those privileges away from the government anytime we are courageous enough to do so.
There's a question that keeps popping up, and a lot of people are not trusting a new Continental Congress to occur because they're thinking that it's those folks who aren't obeying the Constitution in the first place that would participate in it.
Well, there is some confusion, unfortunately, because there is a difference between a Continental Congress and a constitutional convention. A Continental Congress is attempting to enforce the Constitution as it is. Now, we fully admit that there are some flaws in the Constitution, but we are trying to apply it as it stands. The Constitutional Convention is the one that we are afraid of because a Constitutional Convention would legally open up the Constitution to any kind of changes that might be recommended. And you are correct, the people who are currently violating and ignoring the Constitution would love to have a Continental Congress, a Constitutional Convention, so that they could, just scrap the Constitution and come up with something else. It would make it much easier for them to violate our rights. And the confusion stems from the fact that Continental Congress and Constitutional Convention can both be abbreviated CON-CON. And while it is true that a CON-CON, a Constitutional Convention, would be a bad thing, the CON-CON, Continental Congress 2009, has already occurred. We didn't change a thing. We were simply documenting all the ways that people in Washington and people in the state capitals are ignoring these documents and ignoring our rights.
Right, and I think that's where part of the confusion comes from, because they're both deemed as a con-con. So now,
well, they say that ignorance is bliss, but unfortunately ignorance is still ignorance. And if you don't know the difference between a con-con and a con-con, and you have no idea what the Constitution actually says, then people in Washington can pretty much get away with murder.
Right.
I will occasionally begin one of my presentations by asking the audience to raise your hand if you are a good, patriotic American. Not surprising, everybody in the audience raises their hand. Everybody considers themselves, a good, patriotic American. My next question is, raise your hand if you can tell me how many articles are in the Constitution. And sadly, nobody in the auditorium has a clue. The most common guess is 27, which is the number of amendments to the Constitution, not the number of articles that was in the original Constitution. And so, the follow-up is that if you don't know how many, articles are in the Constitution, how the heck are you going to know if the government is violating the Constitution?
Right.
So it's very easy to point our fingers at Washington, D.C., and to explain that, they are violating the Constitution. But most people wouldn't know if it's true or not.
That goes to the point that most people think they get their rights from the Constitution as well.
Yep. It's general misconception.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't even say how many times every day I hear someone say, but my constitutional rights have been violated. Now, the Constitution isn't really talking to you. It's talking to those folks in the three branches of government, telling them what they can and can't do, not you.
Sure.
Now, we had the Articles of Confederation. So when our founding fathers went to, I guess, adjust it, right? They actually went and created a brand new thing, which is our Constitution. So did they do that as a Continental Congress or as...
Well, they did. What they had, the Articles of Confederation were sabotaged. We began the American Revolution. The fighting actually started April 19th, 1775 at Lexington and Concord. And we were shooting and killing each other for a full year before the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. The Declaration of Independence is just a formal declaration of war. The war had already been, occurring for 12 months unofficially. So while the American Revolution was happening, in the Declaration, we had established that we were free, sovereign, and individual states. And if that's true, then we had to have some form of government. And while the American Revolution raged on, we wrote the Articles of Confederation, where each state or each colony was sovereign, had its own money, and the 13 colonies merely joined together as kind of a United Nations of its time. It was a cooperative where they would help defend each other against a tyrannical king. The problem with the Articles of Confederation is that Congress had no power to tax. And after the American Revolution, we owed France and Spain a lot of money that we had borrowed to prosecute the revolution. So, not surprisingly, France and Spain would like to have their money paid back. The 13 colonies were being rather reluctant to do that, and they were printing money like crazy, which caused hyperinflation, which caused the economy to come to a grinding halt. So basically the consensus was, we love freedom, we love independence, but the economy sucks and we got to fix it. To modify the Articles of Confederation, to add a paragraph, delete a sentence perhaps, basically tweak it to make things right. Well, Alexander Hamilton and his cohorts arrived about a week early, and they plotted and planned because they wanted a more centralized government. And so they offered a number of proposals that basically said the Articles of Confederation are beyond repair. They won't work, and therefore what we have to do is we have to throw the Articles of Confederation away and basically start over from scratch. And so basically they did. The Articles of Confederation disappeared. The Constitution became the supreme law, but only after it was ratified. And most people find this astounding. They can't believe that our Constitution is the second Constitution for our country. All you have to do, however, is read the preamble. It says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. More perfect than what, I might ask? And the answer is more perfect than the Articles of Confederation that we just threw away. So if it was possible to throw the Articles of Confederation away, then hypothetically, it is possible for us, we the people, to get together decide that the Constitution is not working and throw the Constitution away, and thereby generate a third most perfect Constitution. The question is, if you throw the Constitution away, what principles, what philosophy are you going to embody in this third most perfect Constitution that will establish peace and freedom and prosperity? And as it turns out, it has nothing to do with the piece of paper. The Constitution is not perfect, admittedly. But even if it were, how is a piece of paper going to guarantee what happens in your country? If you don't know, if you've never read the Constitution, if you don't know what ideas are listed on that piece of paper, and more to the point, you're not willing to stand up and physically defend those ideas, then George Bush was correct, that the Constitution is only a piece of paper, and as far as I'm concerned, we may as well take that piece of paper, bury it underneath an Egyptian pyramid someplace, and perhaps a generation 2,000 years from now will discover it and get some use out of it. Because it's not the Constitution's job to protect us. It is our job to protect the Constitution. And again, you've never read it, that's going to be impossible.
Well, it's just like if you don't know what your rights are, you'll never know if they're being violated or infringed. So how would you suggest someone just starting out figure out what their rights really are, as opposed to, driving is a privilege, of course?
Well, people tend to be really lazy. The quickest way would be to go to my website, constitutionpreservation.org, and go to the book menu and download Chapter 2 of my book. Chapter 2 of my book is called Rights versus Privileges, and in about 6 or 8 pages, it explains all the fundamental details, the difference between rights and privileges, and why the government works for us, not the other way around. If that piques your curiosity, and you go, oh my God, 2 + 2 is 4, and rights and privileges are opposite, then I would recommend that you pick up a copy of Frederick Bastiat's The Law. It's a book called The Law. It's a little tiny pamphlet written in the mid-1700s. And it is a fundamental on what any legitimate government would look like. It doesn't say that Congress will have 2 houses and the president will have a 4-year term. Basically, it gives it in basics. What the government can only do what people would be able to do themselves. If there is no government at all, I'm not allowed to steal from you, and you're not allowed to steal from me. I mean, that just violates the laws of nature. Well, if I cannot steal from you individually, it is unethical for me to try to create a government that will steal from you. If I can't do it, I can't give the government the authority to do it. If I can't kill you, I can't give the government legitimate authority to kill you. And so The Law by Frederick Bastiat gives really clear, simple, childlike understanding of what a legitimate government would look like. And then you pull your nose out of that book and look around, and you will be horrified. You will be absolutely nauseous at the type of government that you see around you here in the United States.
Yeah, well, I agree. When we've got cops tasering 10-year-olds because they won't take a shower, and I mean, all these stories are all over the place. Speaking of the president or even Congress creating these smoking bans, this is a question that's in the chat room. They're wondering what you think of the smoking bans, and if they're actually using it to destroy property rights.
Well, of course they're using it to destroy property rights. Unfortunately, many people don't know what the rights are. They don't know who owns the property. If it is my restaurant, if I own the property, I can choose to allow or disallow smoking at my will. As the property owner, I have absolute control over that. The government has no authority to come in and tell me whether or not I can allow smoking. The government has no authority to tell me what I can do with my body. I own my body. I decide what food I eat, and I decide what liquids I drink. However, back in 1920s, Congress decided to pass prohibition, making it not only illegal, but unconstitutional for American adults to drink alcohol. Where does Congress presume to get the authority to tell a functional adult whether or not they can drink alcohol? I mean, at my age, I certainly don't call my mom and say, Mom, I'm going out with the boys. Is it okay to have a beer? I make those decisions for myself. And, naturally, this law was so unconstitutional that the 18th Amendment was eventually repealed by way of the 21st Amendment. So, okay, we made a really terrible mistake where Congress was trying to tell people what they can do with their bodies. We won't do that again. Oh, really? Well, tell me about all these drug laws in the United States. Where does the federal government get the authority to tell people they're not allowed to smoke marijuana? Or, for that matter, they're not allowed to take heroin or cocaine? Now, just to clarify for your listeners, I have never smoked marijuana in my life. In fact, I've never smoked a cigarette with tobacco in my life. I mean, that's my personal choice. You want to smoke cigarettes? Go ahead. You want to smoke marijuana? Go ahead. Okay? As long as you're not hurting me or damaging my property in the process, you can do anything you want. But we decided that Congress had no authority to tell us whether we could drink alcohol, but now we're going through the same process with other drugs. It's not the government's job to protect you from yourself. Liberty includes the freedom to make stupid choices.
Well, but isn't that one of the mechanisms that we're supposed to be using is making stupid choices, mistakes, and learning from them and figuring a better way to do things?
Well, my hypothesis is that this is a manifestation of parenthood. If you are a parent and you have a small child, you spend all of your waking moments trying to anticipate what your children are going to do. And even then, you're still unsuccessful. I mean, parents know that if you take your eyes off of a 2-year-old for 30 seconds, they're going to find their way underneath the kitchen sink and they're going to be playing with the Drano. I mean, you have to watch them constantly. And as a parent, you develop a habit of preventing accidents before they happen. You don't wait until your child has a toe on the edge of the curb before you yell at them not to go into the street. Parents go through all this time and trouble to prevent things before they happen. Wonderful. Well, once I get to be an adult, Mom, you no longer have the authority to prevent me from doing something. If I wanted to stay out late with the guys and drink too much alcohol, I know that you don't approve and you'll be disappointed with me, but that's now my choice to make. If I want to jump out of perfectly good airplanes, which you think is an act of suicide, then, it's still my choice. You don't have the authority to tell me what to do after I get, to the age of reason. And it is that phenomenon, that history of trying to preempt things before they happen that causes people to demand laws. You know, like all the drunk driving laws. We're trying to prevent an accident before it's happened by, you know, throwing somebody in jail, you know, even though there was no accident. We find you with alcohol in your breath, you're behind the wheel of the car, you're going to jail.
Right.
The problem with that strategy is that it doesn't work. You know, one, we just use it to gain revenue. It's expensive to have a DUI, but if you have enough money, you get out. And people are creatures of habit. If I can not go to jail for my first DUI, then I can do a second one and a third one and a fourth one. And most of the people who are arrested for driving under the influence, it's not their first time. As far as I'm concerned, you are responsible for your actions. You're responsible for the car that you're operating. So if two separate cars travel through two separate intersections and kill two separate passengers, and one driver was drunk and the other one was stone cold sober, as far as I'm concerned, they're both guilty of murder, or at least, you know, involuntary manslaughter. And they will both go to jail for a long time. So I'm putting you in jail, not because you had alcohol in your breath, but because you hurt somebody. Now, it's up to you. If you think that you can operate the car without hurting somebody, you know, using alcohol, that's fine. But in this country, we are innocent until proven guilty. You know, just because you look suspicious, I can't throw you in jail because maybe you're going to rob a bank, or maybe you look like you're going to rape somebody, or maybe you look like you're going to murder somebody. You know, sad to say, in this country, we can't throw you in jail until after, well, you don't actually have to murder somebody, but you have to be in the process of it. You know, if we can stop it at the last possible moment, you know, keep the person alive and then throw you in jail, that's fine. But we can't start throwing people in jail because they look suspicious or because we're being a parent and we're trying to preempt things from, you know, bad things from happening.
Most of our laws now are all to prevent something from happening, and I'm just waiting for, you know, some law that says you can't read the Constitution in public because it might cause someone to think.
Right. Well, we are almost to that point anyway.
Yeah.
I don't remember what year it was passed, but the Homegrown Terrorist Act basically makes you an enemy combatant if you say anything negative about the government. You know, if you are critical of the government, then you are an enemy combatant. And I keep threatening to get a T-shirt that corrects that by saying armed enemy combatant. You know, the people in Washington are violating the Constitution. They are guilty of treason. They are the enemy combatants.
Right.
And the American people better pull their head out of their backside, figure out what the hell is going on, and start indicting these people and putting them in jail.
Yeah, I agree. When Thomas Jefferson was president, didn't they make it law so that you couldn't talk bad about the president or Congress, but kind of said you could talk bad about Thomas Jefferson? And they were actually jailing people who were writing in newspapers and stuff.
Well, you're referring to the Alien and Sedition Acts,
Yeah.
and that was passed by Congress while John Adams was president. John Adams was president right after George Washington. And the Alien and Sedition Act made it illegal to say anything critical about the government. But then it was selectively enforced. Newspapers that said nasty things about Thomas Jefferson, those were allowed to operate.
Right.
Any newspaper that said anything critical of John Adams was immediately put out of business. Now, Thomas Jefferson pointed out that, if you really have freedom of speech, then the Alien and Sedition Act is unconstitutional. And ironically, the Alien and Sedition Act was set to expire the moment that Thomas Jefferson took office.
Right. But even, again, we've got evidence of folks basically committing treason, as far as I'm concerned, as soon as the ink was dry on the Constitution, because they're turning around and making, quote, laws that are contrary to the Constitution.
Well, again, if the people are unaware of it or not smart enough to know about it, then, the people in government are going to get away with murder. There's one thing to be unaware of it. If somebody is in my garage and, they're ripping off all my power tools and I don't know about it, well, okay, somebody is stealing from me. But if I know that somebody is taking stuff out of my garage and I do nothing to stop it, then I almost deserve to have all my stuff taken. Thomas Jefferson said, you only have the rights that you are willing to fight for. And if you want your property, if you want your freedom of speech, if you want your right to keep and bear arms, you're going to have to fight for those rights. Nobody is going to graciously grant you your freedom. Look at the Jews in Nazi Germany. They have a right to life. What kind of piece of paper are they going to be able to give Adolf Hitler to make, the Fuhrer, cut them a little bit of slack? The dear Fuhrer, we think that you're being a little overzealous, in your government policies. That's going to make the Fuhrer stop. You have to recognize that at some point you cannot negotiate with terrorists. There are only two ways to get somebody to do things your way. And that is, first of all, explain things to them intellectually and convince them that they want the same thing too, or to use force. If somebody is using force to, push their agenda, then it is almost certainly immoral and unethical. And so Adolf Hitler had this idea that the Aryan nation was superior and that, other inferior, generations or ethnic types had to be eliminated. Well, if you can't convince these other ethnic types to just voluntarily opt out and you have to use force, your position is obviously, invalid. And at that point in time, if you want to stay alive, if you want to keep your ethnic, people alive, you're going to have to fight back. You're going to have to shoot and kill people. Now, I do not advocate violence. I'm a lover, not a fighter. I would much rather hug somebody than shoot them. But if somebody's trying to take my property, if somebody's trying to hurt me, I'm not just going to stand around and let it happen. People ask me why I carry a gun. And I said, because I abhor violence. And as soon as somebody starts to initiate violence, I can stop it. And most crimes are stopped simply by the presence of a gun. 9 out of 10 times, you don't even have to pull the trigger. All you have to do is display the fact that you have a gun, and the perpetrator of the crime is usually just, seen running off into the sunset.
Right. Well, it goes along with the saying that, a man with a gun doesn't start a fist fight.
Yeah. The problem is that in the United States, people have been brainwashed to think that the only reason for a gun is to commit murder or rob a bank.
Right.
It's like, really, that's what you believe? Then how do you explain all of the guns that the police officers and security people are wearing? Well, that's different. Well, how is that different? Well, they're trained. Well, I've had 30 years of training. I probably shoot better than almost any other police officer out there. So, the idea that, guns are only for violence is ridiculous. And then my favorite one is when somebody tells me that, statistically, the bad guy is more likely to take your gun and use it on you.
Right.
And I'm going, really? That's your statistic? And you're going to hold to that argument? Yep, the bad guy's more likely to use your gun against you. That's when I put my holster on, and I go, okay, show me. Take my gun away from me. They go, no, I'm not going to do that. No, seriously, I want you to take my gun away from me and use it on me. Well, no, you'll shoot me. I go, you bet your ass I'll shoot you. And I'll shoot the bad guy, too. Anybody who is stupid enough to assume that the bad guy is going to use his gun on me more often than I'm going to be able to defend myself with it, I mean, they've been smoking something that the government currently thinks is illegal.
Right. Or that you need permission for it.
Yeah.
That's my favorite. Even though it says the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. And here in Pennsylvania, it says the right to bear arms shall not be questioned. So as far as I'm concerned, they can't even ask me if I'm carrying anything.
Well, when people insist that I have to have a concealed carry permit, I always ask them to show me their church permit.
Right.
And they go, what? They go, did you fill out a government form that allows you to exercise your religion? And occasionally they will school me. They go, Michael, the government cannot require a permit for the exercise of a right. Freedom of religion is a right. I don't need a permit. I go, great. Correct answer. Now explain how the Second Amendment is different than the First Amendment.
Yeah.
If you don't need a church permit, then I sure as hell don't need a concealed carry permit.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Speaking of the Second Amendment, you attended and actually participated and spoke at the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association Convention in January. And I didn't go, but from everybody I've talked to that had attended or knew people who attended said it was a great success. And maybe you could give some more information about exactly what the purpose and what occurred.
It is a little known fact among people or even sheriffs that the sheriff is the highest constitutional authority in the county. The sheriff is a law enforcement or peace officer elected directly by the people. The purpose of the sheriff is to protect the life, liberty, and private property of the people from the government. And while it may seem somewhat preposterous, the sheriff has the authority to throw the federal government out of the county. We vote for the sheriff, and they know it. And they know that their continued service in that office is predicated on whether or not we, the people, are happy with them. And so, very rarely does the sheriff get overly zealous about his job because we can vote the sheriff out of office. So my good friend Sheriff Richard Mack is famous for challenging the Brady Bill, the 5-day waiting period, and taking that all the way to the Supreme Court and getting a victory at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court made a ruling emphasizing the 10th Amendment and clearly, without any question or reservation, pointing out the state government has power over the federal government.
Right.
And again, anybody who reads and understands the 10th Amendment will understand that. So the sheriff is a continuous extension of that authority. And the purpose of the event, January 30th in Las Vegas, was to gather as many sheriffs together as we possibly could to educate them on their constitutional authority, the constitutional basis for their authority, to enlighten them that there are many sheriffs across the country that are already standing up against the federal government and winning. And finally, to reassure the sheriff that they are not in this all by themselves, that the people are, strongly behind them if they are willing to stand up for the rights of the people. So it was a very long day. It was packed with information, and it was a huge success. The 115 sheriffs that attended were thrilled that such an event had taken place and that somebody was already, working to get this kind of an idea organized.
Now, I've talked to regular folks, and they wanted to know how much this actually cost the taxpayers of the counties for the sheriffs to go.
Absolutely nothing. The event was paid for by charitable contributions, by people like yourself who wanted the event to take place, and we raised a little over $100,000, and it cost ballpark, $800 to $1,000 per sheriff to fly them to Vegas, to feed them, put them up in the hotel, and to educate them from. I think it started at 7:30 in the morning. I think registration and breakfast started at 7:30. My presentation was supposed to start promptly at 9 o'clock, and due to a long-winded introduction, my presentation was limited to 45 minutes. That presentation turns out to be one of the best presentations I've ever made. You can watch it on YouTube or at my website, constitutionpreservation.org, and you go to the archive. I forget what it says. Archive media, I think, and you'll see my Las Vegas speech.
Yeah, I know for a fact it's plastered all over the internet now, and folks only need to either Google Constitution Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, or take the shortcut and do
CSPOA.
Right, CSPOA.
Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association.
Right. So that's and there were some really wonderful presentations that have been made available to the public that occurred there. So they're doing another one that's supposed to be coming up, right?
That's scheduled at the moment for Constitution Day weekend. I think it's September 17th in Las Vegas again.
And you're attending, of course, right?
I've been invited to give another presentation. They are modifying this one. They plan to spend more time educating rather than giving anecdotal stories from the other sheriffs.
And there have been sheriffs that have actually stood up to the federal government, besides Sheriff Mack, that I know that we're talking. The sheriff from Nye County in Nevada had spoken there. I know that. So there are constitutional sheriffs out there. It's just a matter of getting them, the ones who aren't, updated and educated. And I guess the other word would be empowered, to know that they're not the only one doing it.
Absolutely. And the best thing for people to do is to contact their sheriff and become friends with them. What you do not want to do is go to your sheriff's office and start banging on his desk, demanding answers to whether or not he's a constitutional sheriff and what would he do in this situation. If you approach the sheriff in an antagonistic manner, the sheriff, like anybody else, is going to respond defensively, and, you're going to be considered that wacko and pretty much ignored. What you want to do is to be as friendly as you can, to establish a rapport, to let the sheriff know that you do support him or her, that, technically you're available to be a part of the posse, as it were, and ask the sheriff politely if he or she has heard about Sheriff Mack, has read Sheriff Mack's books, whether or not they would be interested in attending the event in Las Vegas this September. And if you can, approach them, politely and peacefully, they say that you can attract more flies with honey than vinegar. I think that finding a way to motivate your sheriff to be one of the participants in the September convention would be the best thing that you could do for yourself.
When the first one was happening, I did contact our sheriff, and he's in the mindset that his job is actually to transport people from jail to court and back. So he's definitely a challenge for me to deal with. And I've given him Sheriff Mack's books and everything. He flat out said he wouldn't go. So what do you recommend for other folks who end up with the same type of mindset for a sheriff?
There is strength in numbers. And if you are unfortunate enough to have a sheriff that is closed-minded and believes that they are just a subset of the federal government, I wouldn't waste a whole lot of time.
Right.
Go for the low-hanging fruit. If you can help support somebody else's sheriff, it doesn't matter whether it is your sheriff or not. If you can get a sheriff to come to the event, the more constitutional sheriffs we have, the greater example is going to be for your sheriff. This is kind of like a bank shot in pool. Instead of hitting the object directly, you have to go indirectly. And you may not be able to convince your sheriff to attend the event, but if you can get several sheriffs in the nearby area to attend and come back from the event all enthusiastic about the Constitution, then your recalcitrant sheriff is going to be just a little bit outnumbered. And you'll be able to, you will have created some peer pressure for the sheriff to do things, per the Constitution.
I think that people confuse that the United States Constitution overrides the state constitution.
That's not true. Okay? There is so much confusion about what the Constitution says, it doesn't surprise me that people are misinformed as to where the source of political authority comes from.
Right. And I agree with that. Speaking of the overriding of a constitution, the way the Constitution was written, that the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land and the treaties. Is it possible for a treaty that is contrary to the Constitution to supersede it or override it?
No, because people don't read the words. It says that this Constitution and all of the treaties made in pursuance thereof.
Right.
What does that phrase mean? A treaty made in pursuance to the Constitution means following the same philosophy of a constitutional republic, protecting the life, liberty, and private property of the people. So just because you've made a treaty does not make it the supreme law. That treaty must be, pursuant to the principles of the Constitution. Well, again, if you have no idea what the principles of the Constitution are, how the heck are you ever going to know whether a treaty is legitimate or not?
Right. Because I've got all kinds of people telling me that, we got to get out of the UN treaty and this treaty and that treaty. And I just keep saying, if it's contrary to the Constitution, I don't care. It has no bearing.
Well, I ignore 23,000 gun laws because all of them infringe on my right to keep and bear arms. I've got a right to life, I've got a right to defend my life, and I've got a right to use a gun to defend my life if I think that's the most efficient way to do it. And therefore, none of these 23,000 gun laws applies to me.
Right. And that's what I keep telling folks. These things that they're coming out with don't apply to me because, one, I'm not in the judicial branch, I'm not in the executive branch, and I'm not in I'm not in any of those. I'm me. This stuff doesn't apply to me. So the more I fret about it, it seems that the more people fret about what they're doing, believing that it really affects their individual life, is what gives them, and I mean them being the government, the, quote, power. They're giving it up.
Well, people don't have the courage to make their own decisions. On my website, I have a number of newsletter articles that I've written. And one of the articles that I wrote is called An Appeal to Authority. And it points out that when you're 5 years old, you got to listen to mom and dad. When you get to school, you got to listen to the teachers. Get a driver's license, you got to listen to the police officer. Get a job after college, you got to listen to your manager. And through all of our adult lives, until we're adults, we are constantly looking for someone of higher authority to give us permission. And it just becomes a habit. It's like, oh my gosh, who told you that you could carry that gun? I did. It's like, well, where did you get the authority to decide whether you could carry a gun? Like, okay, imagine that you're walking down the sidewalk and somebody starts to choke you. What are you going to do? Well, I'm going to fight back. I'm going to poke him in the eye. I'm going to kick him in the groin. And who made that decision? Who made the decision that you're going to defend yourself? Did you call the chief of police and get permission? Did you have a letter from the governor of the state that allows you to exercise your self-defense? And they look at me like I'm an idiot. It's like, well, no, they were hurting me, and I just decided it on my own. It's like, well, if you can decide on your own that you're going to defend yourself in an attack, couldn't you also decide on your own that carrying a gun on your hip might prevent the attack in the first place? I make all of the decisions in my life. I decide what foods I eat. I decide whether or not I drink alcohol. I decide whether or not I take drugs. I decide whether or not I jump out of airplanes. And I decide whether or not I'm going to listen to any of these stupid, unconstitutional federal laws. And the answer to that one is always no.
Well, to backtrack on the constitutional sheriff again, there's a question here. Where is the constitutional, in quotations, sheriff coming from? How is it a constitutional sheriff?
Because we are a constitutional republic. A republic is different than a democracy. In a democracy, 51% of the people can take away the rights or property from 49% of the people. In a democracy, the majority wins and the minority always loses. The United States is not a democracy, and you can prove that to yourself by saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution says that every state, that the U.S. government shall guarantee that every state in the Union has a Republican form of government. Like, well, okay, what's that mean? How is a Republican form of government different than a democracy? And the answer is that in a republic, there are certain things you're not allowed to vote on. You're not allowed to vote on my property. You're not allowed to vote on my rights. You're not allowed to vote on what I can or cannot say. And you're not allowed to vote as to whether or not you're going to take my property away. Now, in order to enforce that principle, we, the people, elect somebody that we know, somebody from the community, somebody who is willing to take that job and physically protect our life, liberty, and property. And that is the sheriff. You don't have to elect a sheriff. You could do it yourself. And so if you are courageous enough to wear a gun to defend yourself and defend your property, then I agree. You don't need a sheriff. But most people in the United States are too wishy-washy to do that for themselves. And so electing a sheriff, somebody who's supposedly cool, calm, and, a better shot than you are, is the person who is responsible for protecting life, liberty, and property. Does it say anything in the Constitution about the sheriff? No. No, it doesn't. The Constitution was originally only 4 large pages long. But, you have to understand the fundamental principles of the document. You can't expect to find every little nuance written in the Constitution.
I think that's where part of the confusion comes from, because the Constitution doesn't talk about sheriffs.
Well, again, it's ignorance on the face of the people. If you don't understand these things, you're never going to be able to comprehend it. So the best thing that I can do is to point you to my Chapter 2, Rights versus Privileges, followed by Frederick Bastiat's The Law. And, if you read the law, then the Constitution will start to make a little bit more sense.
Speaking of rights, because I know for a fact that you, quote, exercise and enjoy one of them, and that's why I coined you as the man who put Smokey and the Bandit to shame. Now, for those of you who don't know what Smokey and the Bandit is, it's a movie with Jackie Gleason and Burt Reynolds. And you had a car. You have a car that's pretty much like the Bandit's car, right?
I have a 1988 Pontiac Trans Am. It's much closer to the automobile used in Knight Rider, but Burt Reynolds did drive a Firebird, a black Firebird in that movie.
Now, the difference is your license plate looks a lot different than his.
Well,
and most of the people around here anyway.
I don't have a license plate. A license plate asks for permission. I have an aluminum tag which looks like the Texas flag, and in horizontal letters it says Sovereign Texan. It is clearly not state issued.
Right.
You can tell just by looking at it that it didn't come from Austin, Texas. And it's been the source of a lot of amusement for me as police officers pull me over and I get the opportunity to school them on the difference between traveling, which is a right, and driving, which is a privilege.
Now, you don't have a driver's license.
I don't have a driver's license because I don't drive.
You don't operate in commerce. You're not being paid to
That's
transport
correct.
anybody.
I'm not operating in commerce. Now, when I tell the police officer that I'm not driving, I'm usually sitting in the left seat right behind the steering wheel. And, I mean, the police officer is shocked. But the confusion goes away when you realize that these are legal terms. A driver is somebody who operates a vehicle. A vehicle is any contrivance used to convey goods or passengers for hire. It's all a commercial activity. You know, if I show you, two photographs, of a couple, you can't tell whether they are husband and wife on their honeymoon or, if the woman is being raped. The activity is the same. The question is whether or not it's consensual or not. So, although I may be sitting behind the steering wheel and the engine may be running and I may be traveling from point A to point B, it may look a whole lot like driving to you. But I am not engaged in a commercial activity, and so, your confusion is understanding the difference between these two definitions.
Between English and legalese.
Yes. Lawyers literally call them words of art. They deliberately create these phrases which have a special meaning to them that, you understand the words and you interpret the phrase one way where the judge and the attorneys are interpreting it another way.
And I think that's where a lot of people get tied up when they're actually talking is they think they're talking about the same thing, just like in the scenario of when people are talking about God. They all think that they're talking about the same God, and they're not. Just like we're not all talking about the same thing when it comes to, quote, driving or traveling or one of my favorite Supreme Court decisions based on our right to travel, and I don't have it up in front of me, and so I can't tell you exactly who said this, but the Supreme Court actually went so far as to say that the people have a right to travel in their modern day conveyance, seeing that, cars are coming about and not knowing what else is going to come about. So it just didn't pertain to a horse or a horse and buggy or what have you. So that's one of my favorites.
I think that was Illinois versus Chicago Motor Coach. I could be wrong, but that's one of the most common references in this particular argument.
Right. We've got folks still talking about the constitutional sheriff, and so what I did was I pulled up the 1790 Pennsylvania Constitution because it's the easiest one for me to grab. And yes, they do talk about the sheriff a number of times. Let's see what I've got here, because I think people, again, are thinking that the United States Constitution supersedes the the individual state constitution. And yeah, the 1790, even in, Pennsylvania Constitution, Article 6, Section 1, sheriffs and coroners shall, at the time and places of election of representatives, be chosen by the citizens of each county. 2 persons shall be chosen. So, yeah, we do have constitutional sheriffs. Just in this one alone, sheriff is all over the place in this. Schedule, Section 5. No person now in commission as sheriff shall be eligible at the next election for a longer term than will, with the time. See, this is just turning into crazy language for me. With the time which he shall have served in the said office, complete the term of 3 years. So, there you go. folks in the states just need to look up their own state constitution to find their constitutional sheriff. And it says what they're, how they're elected and what their duties are. So just to clarify that, it seems we've gotten a lot of noise about this one, the constitutional sheriffs. I definitely do want to attend the next one. So are they going to accept folks who may be possibly running for sheriff to attend, or is it just for the sheriffs who've been elected?
That was a big debate. For the first event, we tended to limit it to people who were already sheriff in office. But I am not directly involved in the organization of the second event, and so I'm not sure how that distinction is going to be made. I suspect that if a sheriff candidate is willing to, pay their own transportation, that they would not be denied access to the information. I can't confirm that, though, again.
I think that might be a good question. If it's somebody who is wanting to be sheriff, I could see the reasons for having them pay their own way, so to speak, as opposed to the sheriffs who are already there and willing to get educated and get some folks behind them, other sheriffs to support them. So I'd rather have those folks be able to attend. Now, they're doing it the same way, right, with the donations from whomever chooses to donate, right?
I am not directly involved in the organization of the second one. I would presume that that's how they are doing it, but I've been redirecting my efforts to a project in Texas.
Right, and you'll be going back to Texas. So I know that there's a bunch of folks that I talk to in Texas that are just sitting in anticipation, waiting for you to return. And down in Texas, they've got their own gun laws and, or I should say statutes, not actual quote law. You still carry your gun down there?
Well, the quickest way to find out is to threaten my life.
Okay, well, that would definitely be a quick way to find out if anyone's carrying them.
I had a young man come up to me, was all excited, and I confess that I don't remember what state I was in. But he was very excited because he had this statistic that there were more concealed carry permits in his state than there were in Texas. And so I kind of shrugged my shoulders and I go, yeah, so what? And he says, well, that means there are more people carrying guns in his state than there are carrying guns in Texas. And I said, no. That just means that there are more people in your state who have submitted to ask for permission. I said, a lot of people in Texas carry guns, and we don't need no stinking badges. So I said it would be, a gross misjudgment on your part to assume that there are more people in your state carrying guns than there are in Texas.
Well, doesn't the Texas Constitution, while it, says the people have the right to bear arms, they added a extra section. Do you know when they added that extra section to where legislature could make decisions on who and what and where and when?
I don't remember, but it's invalid. It doesn't apply to me because it infringes on my rights. The federal government is not allowed to infringe on my rights. The state government is not allowed to infringe on my rights. The county government, the city government, nobody is allowed to infringe on my rights. As long as I'm not hurting somebody else or taking somebody else's property, I can do pretty much anything I want. I'm sovereign. It's good to be king. And you got to understand that premise. I don't ask the government for permission. I don't need the government's permission to exist. The government needs my permission. The government does need my permission to exist. So why would I ask the government for permission?
Exactly. Well, like I said, you are one of the few very public people who exercise and enjoy their rights, and you know exactly what your rights are.
Absolutely. And more to the point, I'm willing to fight and die for those rights.
Well, you draw the line in the sand, and you're not letting anybody cross it.
That's right. Just for the record, drawing a line in the sand is a phrase that stems from the Alamo, and it's often misused. At the Alamo, Colonel William Travis decided that he was going to stay and defend the Alamo, victory or death. Require the men in his command to stay. And so the night before the final battle, he formally dismissed all of his men. He says, "You are all free to go home. I'm going to stay. However, if anybody wants to stay, you have to actively take some action." And he drew a line in the sand with his saber. And he said, "You can't just stand there with the rest of the crowd and going to get sucked up into the battle. You have to physically stand up and walk across this line. You have to demonstrate by your own actions that you are willing to stay." And that's the line in the sand from the Alamo.
Right.
Usually, we use that to challenge the bad guy to violate our rights. It's like the chip on the shoulder. Knock this chip off my shoulder and I'll punch you in the nose. And so, I don't mind. I just like to get everybody's history accurate so that, especially with Texas history, so they know the actual conclusion.
So next weekend, I should say, you're doing your constitutional class, is that right?
No.
No.
Next weekend, I will be traveling down to, this coming Saturday, I'm going to fly to Minnesota. I'm giving a presentation at another raw milk rally. There's another farmer up in Minnesota who's being attacked by the state government, trying to make it illegal for people to drink milk from a cow. We're not talking heroin or cocaine. We're talking about milk.
Milk that hasn't been processed.
Right. It comes out of the cow into a glass, and you drink it. I worked on a cattle ranch for a year and a half. Raw milk is my favorite thing to drink. I love it. But, the government thinks that it owns my body. The government thinks that it can be my parent and tell me what I can or cannot do. And at my age, I take umbrage with that. The weekend after that, the 19th and 20th, I'm traveling to central Indiana, and I will be offering a gun safety and pistol proficiency class. We're going to start out the day trying to teach people what they need to know so they don't accidentally shoot themselves. And then we will spend some time teaching them not just to hit the target, but to hit the middle of the target and to be able to successfully and adequately defend themselves from attack.
So you're pretty accessible for folks to get a hold of for their events, or if they would like your support in defending themselves or learning how to use guns.
Yeah.
And you're still doing your constitutional classes too.
Well, I am willing to do my constitutional classes. Unfortunately, the level of interest in my constitution classes has dwindled to nothing. I moved from Texas to Indiana in the first place because I couldn't afford to pay the rent. I usually get a phone call from one or two people that are all excited. They want me to be able to teach my class, but I can't travel, can't buy an airplane ticket for just, 2 or 3 students. I mean, it's got to be worth my time and effort. And so, I require at least about 25 people to be in class before I'm willing to, go through all the organizational effort. So the problem is that I can't find enough interest in a given location to make it practical to teach my class. But if anybody is interested, you can visit my website, constitutionpreservation.org, go to the class menu, and you can request a city. And not only that, you need to get 24 of your friends to request the same city so that I know that there is sufficient interest in one location.
Now, I find that kind of ironic that the request for your constitutional classes dwindled down, considering Ron Paul's running. And weren't you the first person to endorse him in 2008?
Well, for his 2008 campaign, I endorsed Ron Paul in February of 2007, about 30 days after he made the announcement that he was going to make a run for the president. And, there was some enthusiasm for my class, and I agree that logically, with more people aware of Ron Paul, that, they would also be curious about the Constitution. But apparently, the economy continues to get worse. People are struggling to pay the rent and put food on the table. And any extra money that they have, they are typically dedicating to Ron Paul's campaign. And, we all have limited resources. You can't buy everything that you want. And so I believe that most people are, using their disposable income and routing it through Ron Paul's campaign. So, that's fine. Nobody has any obligation to pay for my class. On the other hand, I'm not obligated to give the class for free just because 2 or 3 people would like to hear me. So, it's kind of like Jerry Maguire. Show me the money, and I'll show up and provide my class.
Right. Well, in all honesty, you need to eat too. But I do find it ironic. Do you think that, and I know I've asked you this before, so this is a repeat question. Do you think 3 times a charm for Ron Paul this time? This is the 3rd time he's running for president.
I will confess that Ron Paul has been far more successful than I imagined he would be. I have grown terribly cynical about the electoral process in this country. I've been a computer programmer for well over 40 years now, and if you allow me to write the software and keep it proprietary, I will tell you who's going to win by what percentage point before the polls even open.
Right.
So casting your vote on an electronic voting machine is like writing your name in the sand at the beach. It's not going to be there for very long. So I do not trust the electoral process. Almost all Ron Paul supporters are painfully aware how the mainstream media ignores Ron Paul. They slander Ron Paul. They create all sorts of phony accusations against him and his campaign. And fortunately, the only thing that does is make Ron Paul supporters even more resolute than they were before. But frankly, I no longer believe that we can restore liberty without violence. If you're in a dark alley and somebody's pointing a gun at you and they want your money, you could, I suppose, put your hands up and say, I'm being non-controversial or non-confrontational this week, and I'd really appreciate it if you wait for the next person to come along. Well, you could try that strategy, but I doubt that it's going to be very successful. At some point in time, you have to realize that you cannot negotiate with terrorists, that the people who are manipulating the elections are not going to allow a legitimate expression of the will of the people. We're going to have to carry Ron Paul into the White House physically on our shoulders. We're going to have to overwhelm the process. And, bad guys are not going to go away quietly. So I don't know what is going to happen. I'm certainly not encouraging anybody to be prone to violence. But I do encourage people to be willing and prepared to defend themselves, regardless of whether or not the person attacking you is wearing a uniform.
Right. Well, I personally see self-defense completely different than violence. Violence to me is something that is coming at me when it's not.
If somebody's coming at you and you pull out a gun and pull the trigger and kill them, that is violence. When an adult walks into the room and there are two small children who've, been caught fighting, the children never say, we weren't fighting. The children always say, he started it.
Right.
Even a child understands that, violence is acceptable if you are defending yourself from an initiation of attack.
Right.
Yes, I was hitting him back, but that was because he started it, he hit me first. And if adults are not smart enough to understand that logic, then, you're never going to be able to defend yourself. I was planning to help a man purchase his first gun until we had a conversation, and he admitted that he would defend himself from a civilian, but he said, and it still strikes me as odd, said that if a police officer was attacking him, that he would be required to stand there and let it happen, because he's not allowed to resist, a police officer. Now, I don't know how somebody gets to the point where they truly believe that, but I told this man that I would not help him buy a gun because he wouldn't be smart enough to use it when the time came. And he says, well, who's going to fix the problem? And I said, I am. And he goes, well, I want to help. And I said, no, you don't. I said, you're not willing to defend your own life. What makes you think that you've got the testosterone to protect somebody else's liberty? I said, you just hide under your desk with your butt hanging out, and I'll call you when it's safe to come out and play. He goes, well, that's really embarrassing. I said, it damn well should be. I would be embarrassed if I wasn't brave enough to defend myself.
I don't know how anybody can think that they're going to defend someone else when they are completely unwilling to defend themselves. It makes no sense at all. It's basically an oxymoron.
Well, it is to me, but I do know that there are people out there. Apparently there are still people who believe the world is flat. It's like, well, okay, you can believe whatever you want. You're wrong, but, go ahead and believe it. So, I was very serious. I will not help him, find a gun because it's just going to put him in more danger later.
Right.
When the police come to collect his guns, he's going to hand it over, and then he's going to, go to the FEMA concentration camp because he was armed.
Yeah.
You're better off not having the gun. You can cower in the corner and they'll let you go and, probably not shoot you on the spot. I don't know.
I agree that you should not have a sword or a gun or even, kitchen knives in your kitchen. Because, they'll say, you have weapons. I mean, weapons is a pretty broad term.
Well, I think the police should come and trim his nails once a week so that his nails don't get long enough for them to scratch them.
You come up with some of the best anecdotes. Yes, I would love to hear that phone conversation when he calls the police too. Come trim my nails so I don't scratch you. There's another question here in the chat room, and it's basically they want to know if there's any reason to trust corporations that have shareholders, and I can only relate this to what's going on with the Occupy movements that are blaming Wall Street and the big corporations for what's going on.
Well, corporations are made up of people, and it's people that you cannot trust. Anytime, you have people who are able to manipulate property or manipulate stock, without anybody watching, you're going to have some kind of corruption. People have never learned ethics. Ethics is doing the right thing even when nobody is looking. If you choose not to steal something because you know there are cameras watching your every move, that's not ethics. That's just being cagey. And, if you're attempting to get away with whatever you can get because you didn't get caught, that's not ethics. And unfortunately, we no longer teach ethics in our society anymore. And most of the people who have risen to the top in corporations have done so because, again, they are able to manipulate money and property without the watchful eye of anybody. When the airlines, are going bankrupt, the managers demand, wage concessions from the pilots and the flight attendants, and then they give themselves these huge $1 million bonuses for being so clever in helping to avert a disaster.
Right. Well, I'm not sure that, talking about companies versus government, I hate saying, the government's doing this and the government's doing that. The government's not doing anything because it's a figment of your imagination when it comes down to it. It's the people in those seats. And my problem with the way our system is set up is it actually requires everybody who is voting to be politically intellectual and inept in order to get the right people in those seats for what they want.
What it requires is for people to be responsible for themselves. If you have people in government, they can be corrupt. If you have people in corporations, they can be corrupt. Who's supposed to be protecting your life, your liberty, your property? That would be you.
Right.
And you can't expect the corporations to protect your property any more than you can expect the government to protect your liberty. It's insane. Wake the hell up and start doing it yourself.
Exactly. With having rights, and you say it all the time, the flip side of the coin is responsibility. You have to be personally responsible. If you're not, then, you're just, as I put it, sucking off the government or licking the, let me put it nicely because we're on air, licking the manure off the government boot.
If you give your responsibilities to either the corporation or the government, and they do a really bad job, you can't blame them. You got to blame yourself for giving those responsibilities away.
Right. Well, it's like, regular folks, they're putting their money into a, quote, pension that's invested into different corporations. If they lose, then they get mad. And it's like, well, maybe you should have, not put your money in there and chose to do something different with it. I don't know, buy some silver or heirloom seeds or something. Do something different with it.
Well, the people in France were experiencing economic hardship. The government was going bankrupt. And so they elected President Sarkozy, and he, in an attempt to put an end, to prevent the bankruptcy, installed various austerity measures. Basically, the government was spending too much money, and he stopped spending. Well, the problem is that the French people were on the receiving end of that money, and yesterday, or Saturday, I guess, they voted to elect a socialist president who's going to eliminate all of those austerity measures and give the French people what they want, which is going to work for about 2 or 3 years, and then, France will no longer exist as a country. The people just voted to commit economic suicide because they're not smart enough to know that you can't kill the goose that laid the golden egg. There's only so much money that the government has. And if nobody's, putting more money in, then there's no money to be had. So the same thing the French people were voting against this weekend is going to happen whether they like it or not, just, a few short years into the future.
Yeah. Again, like I said, with our current system, the folks are, and I don't mean everybody, of course, but generally the folks are too busy sticking their hand out. President, you must give me a job. President, you must make abortions illegal. President, you must do all these things that he has nothing to do with. So how do we go about getting these folks to realize that, there's certain things that the president is not able to do. And if we make it so he's able to do it, then he can circumvent Congress and the judiciary and everything else. And we might as well just go back to having a complete tyrant.
Well, again, we keep focusing on Washington, D.C. as the problem, when in reality it's a vast majority of the American people who are encouraging that form of government. They're voting for the Democrats and Republicans. They may be voting for the lesser of two evils, but when you vote for the lesser of two evils, you still get evil. And, the American people are not much smarter than the French. We're just not as far down the line as France is. But we will be there very soon.
Well, I just wonder if we're not already there and we just don't know it.
Well, if we don't know it, then, it's a moot question.
Yeah. So to end, because the time's coming to an end, which I hate doing, because I love having you around and talking with you about all kinds of stuff. Besides booking you for your constitutional class or inviting you to events such as, the milk rally or whatever other event that people are having, what solutions can just individual folks do on their own to gather friends and neighbors in with them?
That's up to you. Take the responsibility to figure it out. Read the Bastiat's the Law, read the Articles of Freedom, and figure out what you think is the worst problem and do something about it. I don't have a checklist for freedom.
You're supposed to. That's one of your jobs, don't you know?
Well, pretty damn bad. When I die, liberty's no longer my problem. You know, I've been offering my class and nobody wants to take it. And so I'm basically giving up on, you know, the whole patriot community. I'm going back to Texas and I'm going to take care of me.
I completely comprehend that one. You can only do so much for other people. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him give you a nice ride, to put it nicely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for coming on, and I'm sure that I will be having you back again soon.
Okay. That sounds good.
All right. And folks can get your second chapter on rights versus privileges at constitutionpreservation.org and invite you to their events.
Absolutely. I'm not very low profile.
No, you're not. Well, thank you so much, Michael.
Okay, dear.
And I will be talking with you soon.
All right.
All right. Thanks, honey.
That's all, folks.